The morning mist hung low over the glass towers of Manhattan, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the trepidation dwelling within the hearts of those who worked beneath their imposing heights. Among these monoliths of commerce stood Thornfield Industries, a name whispered with equal parts reverence and dread throughout the corridors of corporate America. Its 47 floors pierced the sky like a needle, sharp and unforgiving, much like the man who commanded its empire from the topmost sanctuary. Alexander Thornfield was not merely wealthy, he was possessed of that particular species of fortune that transforms a man into something approaching legend, though whether heroic or cautionary depended entirely upon one's proximity to his sphere of influence. At 34, he had accumulated riches that would have made Croesus himself pause in wonder, yet his true currency was not gold, but fear. It was a commodity he had learned to trade with masterful precision, for he had discovered early in his ascent that terror, properly administered, could move mountains and men with equal facility. The origins of his formidable reputation were not without foundation. Those who had witnessed his displeasure firsthand spoke of it in hushed tones, describing eyes that could freeze the very blood in one's veins, and a voice that, when raised even slightly above its customary measured cadence, could reduce grown men to stammering children. Board meetings under his direction were affairs of military precision, where the slightest deviation from perfection was met with consequences that extended far beyond mere professional embarrassment. His personal life, if such a term could be applied to the carefully orchestrated existence he maintained, was equally subject to his exacting standards. The penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park was a testament to aesthetic perfection, every piece of furniture, every work of art positioned with mathematical precision. No disorder was permitted within these walls, no spontaneity tolerated. His staff moved through the space like ghosts, efficient and invisible, understanding implicitly that their continued employment depended upon their ability to anticipate his needs, while remaining utterly unremarkable in their execution of duty. Women, those brave or ambitious enough to enter his orbit, soon discovered that proximity to Alexander Thornfield came at a price few were willing to pay. He demanded nothing less than absolute devotion, while offering only the most carefully measured portions of his attention in return. His romantic entanglements, if they could be dignified with such a term, were as precisely orchestrated as his business dealings, partnerships of mutual benefit that dissolved the moment their utility expired. Yet for all his accumulated power and wealth, Alexander Thornfield was not without his vulnerabilities, though these were buried so deeply beneath layers of calculated indifference that even he had nearly forgotten their existence. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city below still slumbered and his apartment stood silent as a tomb, he sometimes felt the weight of his isolation pressing upon him like a physical thing. These moments of weakness were brief and ruthlessly suppressed, dismissed as the idle fancies of an overtaxed mind. It was into this carefully constructed world of absolute control that fate, with its characteristic disregard for human planning, chose to introduce an element of chaos that would prove more dangerous than any corporate rival or market downturn Alexander had ever faced. The morning that would mark the beginning of his undoing dawned grey and unremarkable, the kind of weather that seemed to sap the very color from the world. Alexander arrived at his office at precisely 7:30, as was his unchanging custom, to find his assistant Margaret waiting with her usual complement of briefings, schedules, and the various reports that required his attention. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, possessed of that particular brand of efficiency that comes from decades of service, in environments where error is not merely discouraged, but potentially catastrophic. "Your 9 o'clock appointment has been moved to 10:30, she reported in her crisp, professional tone. "The Henderson contract requires your signature, and there are 17 messages marked urgent awaiting your attention." Alexander nodded curtly, already settling behind his desk, a monument of mahogany and steel that served as both workspace and barrier between himself and the world. The office itself was a reflection of his nature, austere yet luxurious, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. Every element had been chosen not for comfort, but for the impression it would leave upon visitors, the subtle reminder that they stood in the presence of power incarnate. It was, as he was reviewing the quarterly projections, his attention focused with laser-like intensity upon the columns of figures that would determine the fate of thousands of employees, that Margaret cleared her throat with the particular delicacy that preceded announcements of some significance. "Sir, I must inform you that I shall be departing at the end of the month." The words fell into the silence of the office like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that Alexander felt more than heard. He raised his eyes from the documents, fixing Margaret with a stare that had been known to cause seasoned executives to stumble over their carefully prepared presentations. "Explain." Margaret, to her credit, did not flinch beneath his scrutiny. "My husband's health has declined significantly. The doctors recommend a change of climate, somewhere warmer and less demanding. We have decided to relocate to Arizona." For a moment that stretched between them like a chasm, Alexander said nothing. Margaret had been with Thornfield Industries for 15 years, had weathered countless storms and crises with unflappable composure. Her departure would create a void that would be both professionally inconvenient and personally unsettling. Yet he had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. "I trust you will ensure that your replacement is adequately prepared for the responsibilities of this position." "Of course, sir. I have already begun reviewing applications and conducting preliminary interviews. There are several candidates who appear promising." And so it was that the machinery of replacement was set in motion, though neither Alexander nor Margaret could have foreseen the particular individual that fate would select for this crucial role. In the days that followed, a parade of candidates presented themselves for consideration, each more qualified than the last, each more thoroughly intimidated by the prospect of working in such close proximity to the legendary Alexander Thornfield. There was Miss Patterson, whose impeccable credentials were undermined by a tendency to stammer when nervous. Mr. Williams possessed an impressive resume, but made the fatal error of attempting to negotiate his starting salary during the interview. Mrs. Chen had the necessary experience, but seemed to wilt visibly under Alexander's penetrating gaze, her confident demeanor crumbling like sand beneath the tide. Each interview followed the same predictable pattern. The candidate would arrive punctually, dressed in their finest professional attire, armed with carefully rehearsed responses to anticipated questions. They would sit in the leather chair across from Alexander's desk, hands folded neatly in their laps, speaking in measured tones about their qualifications and experience. And inevitably, as the interview progressed and Alexander's questions became more pointed, more demanding, their composure would begin to fray at the edges until they sat before him like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming vehicle. It was Margaret who first mentioned the name that would soon become synonymous with upheaval in Alexander's carefully ordered existence. "There is one additional candidate I believe you should consider," she said, her tone carrying a note of something Alexander could not quite identify. "Miss Catherine Earnshaw. Her qualifications are unconventional, but there is something about her that suggests she might be uniquely suited to this environment." Alexander barely glanced up from the contract he was reviewing. "Schedule the interview." For thus it was arranged that on a Thursday morning in late October, as the first chill of autumn began to creep through the city's concrete canyons, Catherine Earnshaw would climb the 47 floors to Alexander Thornfield's office and, in the span of a single conversation, begin the systematic dismantling of everything he believed he understood about power, control, and the proper order of things. The morning in question dawned with deceptive tranquility, the sky a pale blue, stretched thin as silk above the urban landscape. Alexander arrived at his office with his usual punctuality, his movements sharp and purposeful as he settled into his morning routine. The leather portfolio containing Catherine Earnshaw's resume lay precisely centered on his desk, though he had scarcely bothered to examine its contents beyond noting her educational credentials, a degree from Columbia, summa cum laude, followed by several years of experience at smaller firms. At precisely 10 o'clock, Margaret announced the arrival of the final candidate. Alexander straightened in his chair, prepared to conduct yet another exercise in professional intimidation, when the office door opened and Catherine Earnshaw stepped into his domain. She was not what he had expected. Where previous candidates had chosen conservative blacks and greys, she wore a deep burgundy suit that seemed to capture and reflect the autumn light filtering through the windows. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that was professional, yet somehow suggested that convention held no particular terror for her. But it was her eyes that gave Alexander pause. Dark, intelligent, and utterly without the deference he had come to expect from those who entered his presence. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, extending her hand with the kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from an absolute certainty of one's own worth. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Alexander rose and accepted her handshake, noting the firmness of her grip, the way she met his gaze without flinching. Already the familiar patterns of dominance and submission that governed his interactions with the outside world seemed somehow inadequate to the task at hand. "Please, sit." He gestured to the leather chair, watching as she settled herself with the kind of unconscious grace that spoke of breeding and education. "I trust you understand the nature of the position you're seeking." Catherine's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though her eyes remained serious. "I believe I do. You require someone who can manage your schedule, handle your correspondence, and serve as a buffer between yourself and the outside world. You need someone who can think quickly, act decisively, and maintain absolute discretion in all matters pertaining to your personal and professional affairs." The response was textbook perfect, exactly what any competent candidate would say, yet there was something in her delivery, a subtle emphasis that suggested she understood implications beyond the merely professional. "The demands of this position are considerable," Alexander continued, settling back into his chair and fixing her with the stare that had proven so effective at unsettling her predecessors. "I do not tolerate incompetence, indecision, or any form of emotional volatility. The individual who fills this role must be prepared to subordinate their personal concerns entirely to the requirements of the position." For a long moment, Catherine said nothing, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that Alexander found oddly unsettling. Then, to his surprise, she leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more animated. "Mr. Thornfield, may I ask you a question?" The request was so unexpected that Alexander found himself nodding before he had fully considered the implications. In 15 years of conducting interviews, no candidate had ever dared to turn the tables in such a manner. "Do you believe that fear is truly the most effective tool for maintaining control?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, its implications rippling outward in ways that Alexander was not prepared to contemplate. He had built his entire professional identity upon the premise that power derived from the ability to instill apprehension in others, that respect and fear were merely different words for the same fundamental emotion. "I believe," he said carefully, his voice dropping to the measured tone that had preceded the professional destruction of countless individuals, "that clarity of expectation and consequence is essential for optimal performance." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words from multiple angles. "An interesting perspective, though I wonder if such an approach might not ultimately prove limiting. After all, fear may ensure compliance, but it rarely inspires excellence. And excellence, I would imagine, is what truly drives an organization like Thornfield Industries." The observation was delivered without challenge or confrontation, yet Alexander felt something shift within him, a reaction he could not immediately categorize. No one had ever questioned his methods so directly, so fearlessly. The board of directors deferred to his judgment without question. His employees scurried to fulfill his every directive, and even his few remaining friends treated him with the kind of careful respect reserved for dangerous animals. Yet here sat this woman, this Catherine Earnshaw, regarding him with the kind of calm assessment one might apply to an interesting puzzle, rather than a force of nature to be appeased and avoided. "You seem remarkably comfortable challenging potential employers, Miss Earnshaw. Only when I believe the challenge might lead to a more productive outcome for all parties involved." Her smile became more pronounced, though her eyes remained watchful. "I suspect, Mr. Thornfield, that you've grown accustomed to a particular type of interaction, one in which your position and reputation precede you into every room, ensuring that conversations unfold according to predictable patterns. But I wonder if such predictability might not, in its own way, be a form of limitation." Alexander felt his jaw tighten, though whether from anger or something else entirely he could not say. "You believe you understand my circumstances better than I do myself? Not at all. But I do believe that sometimes the most valuable service one can provide is to see situations from a perspective that hasn't been influenced by proximity to power." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatic yet pointed, and Alexander realized with a growing sense of unease that this conversation had departed entirely from the script that had governed every other interview. Catherine Earnshaw was not seeking his approval in the manner of her predecessors. She was evaluating him as much as he was evaluating her. "And what?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of the steel that had cowed boardrooms full of executives, "makes you believe that your perspective would be of value to someone in my position?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting to the window behind his desk, where the city stretched out in all its chaotic glory. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality of thoughtfulness that seemed at odds with the clinical efficiency of the corporate environment. "Because, Mr. Thornfield, I suspect that beneath all the carefully constructed barriers you've erected, you're as curious about the answer to that question as I am." The observation struck him like a physical blow, not because it was particularly profound, but because it was true. In all his years of accumulated power and influence, he had surrounded himself with individuals who told him what they believed he wanted to hear, who reflected back his own assumptions and prejudices in an endless loop of confirmation. The possibility that someone might offer a genuinely different perspective, one not filtered through fear or self-interest, was both terrifying and oddly compelling. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Thornfield found himself genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. The interview had become something else entirely, a conversation whose outcome he could not predict or control. And perhaps most unsettling of all, he discovered that some part of him, a part he had thought long since buried beneath layers of calculated indifference, was curious to see where such a conversation might lead. "The position requires absolute loyalty," he said finally, though the words felt somehow inadequate to the moment. "Loyalty, yes," Catherine agreed, "but perhaps not the kind you're thinking of. True loyalty isn't born from fear, Mr. Thornfield. It comes from respect, genuine respect, earned through actions rather than imposed through authority. And respect, I've found, is something that flows both ways." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, feeling as though he stood at the edge of some vast precipice whose depths he could not fathom. Everything in his experience told him to end this interview immediately, to thank Miss Earnshaw politely for her time and send her on her way before her unconventional perspectives could contaminate the carefully ordered environment he had spent years perfecting. Yet something, call it curiosity, call it the first stirring of a hunger he had not acknowledged even to himself, prevented him from speaking the words of dismissal. Instead, he found himself asking, "When could you start?" The question surprised them both, hanging in the air like a decision made by some other version of himself, one less concerned with maintaining absolute control over every variable in his environment. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, though she recovered her composure with admirable speed. "Immediately, if necessary. Monday morning, 7:30. I'll be here." As Catherine rose and extended her hand once more, Alexander felt the weight of a decision whose full implications he could not yet comprehend. Her handshake was firm, confident, and as she turned to leave, he caught the faint scent of jasmine, subtle but unmistakably present. After she had gone, and Margaret had returned to her desk with the satisfied expression of someone whose duty had been properly discharged, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring out at the city below. For 34 years, he had lived according to principles of control and dominance that had served him well, transforming him from the angry, ambitious young man he had once been into the force of nature that now commanded one of the country's most powerful corporations. Yet in the space of a single conversation, Catherine Earnshaw had introduced variables into his carefully calculated existence that threatened to upset the delicate balance he had spent so many years perfecting. She had challenged his fundamental assumptions about power and loyalty, had looked upon his fearsome reputation without apparent intimidation, and had somehow managed to leave him feeling as though he had been the one subjected to evaluation rather than conducting it. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across his office floor, Alexander found his thoughts returning again and again to their conversation, parsing her words for meanings he might have missed, analyzing her expressions for clues to her true intentions. It was, he realized with a growing sense of unease, the first time in years that another human being had managed to capture his attention so completely. Monday morning, he told himself, would bring clarity. The artificial intimacy of the interview environment would give way to the more familiar dynamics of employer and employee, superior and subordinate. Catherine Earnshaw would take her place within the established order of things, her unconventional perspectives tempered by the realities of corporate hierarchy and the inexorable pressure of his expectations. Yet even as he assured himself of these certainties, a small voice in the depths of his consciousness whispered that Monday morning might prove to be far more complicated than he anticipated. Catherine Earnshaw had already demonstrated a remarkable resistance to intimidation, an independence of thought that suggested she would not be easily molded to fit his requirements. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Thornfield found himself contemplating Monday morning with something approaching anticipation, and perhaps, though he would not admit it even to himself, with the faintest touch of fear. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that seemed to mock Alexander's internal tumult. He had spent the weekend in his customary fashion, a carefully structured routine of morning exercise, afternoon work, and evening solitude that left no room for idle contemplation or unwelcome introspection. Yet despite his best efforts to maintain the disciplined focus that had become second nature to him, his thoughts had returned with frustrating regularity to the woman who would, in a matter of hours, take her place within the inner sanctum of his professional domain. By 7:15, he was already seated at his desk, the morning reports spread before him in their usual precise arrangement. Margaret had prepared a comprehensive briefing for Catherine's first day, complete with detailed instructions regarding his preferences, schedules, and the various protocols that governed his interactions with the outside world. Everything had been anticipated, catalogued, and reduced to manageable procedures. Everything, that is, except the fundamental question of how Catherine Earnshaw would respond to the realities of working in such close proximity to his particular brand of authority. At precisely 7:30, the elevator chimed its arrival, and Alexander found himself listening with unwanted attention to the sound of footsteps in the outer office. Margaret's voice, warm and welcoming, carried through the partially open door as she greeted the newest member of their small, exclusive circle. "Miss Earnshaw, welcome to Thornfield Industries. I trust you found the building easily enough. Please call me Catherine. And yes, thank you. Your directions were perfectly clear." Even filtered through the intervening space, Catherine's voice carried that same quality of assured confidence that had so unsettled Alexander during their interview. There was no trace of the nervousness that might reasonably be expected from someone beginning their first day in such a demanding position. No hint of the deference that had characterized every other employee's initial interactions with the executive floor. For the next hour, Alexander listened to the murmur of voices as Margaret conducted Catherine through the various systems and procedures that would govern her daily responsibilities. Occasionally, he caught fragments of their conversation, discussions of filing systems, communication protocols, and the intricate web of relationships that connected Thornfield Industries to the broader world of corporate America. Catherine's questions were thoughtful and incisive, demonstrating an understanding of organizational dynamics that went well beyond mere technical competence. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Margaret finally knocked on his office door, entering with Catherine at her side. In the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the corporate environment, she appeared even more striking than Alexander remembered, her professional attire somehow managing to suggest both competence and an underlying vitality that seemed at odds with the sterile efficiency of their surroundings. "Mr. Thornfield," Margaret announced, "I believe Miss Earnshaw is ready to begin her duties." Alexander rose from his chair, noting how Catherine's gaze moved quickly around the office, taking in the various elements that comprised his working environment with the kind of systematic assessment he might have applied to a new acquisition or strategic opportunity. When her eyes finally met his, he saw none of the carefully suppressed apprehension that had characterized his interactions with previous assistants. "Good morning, Catherine," he said, testing the sound of her given name on his lips. "I trust Margaret has provided you with adequate orientation regarding your responsibilities?" "She has, indeed, though I suspect the true education will come from practical experience rather than theoretical preparation." The observation was delivered with a slight smile that Alexander found oddly disarming. Most new employees spent their first weeks in a state of heightened anxiety, desperately seeking approval and validation of their performance. Catherine, however, seemed to view her new position as an interesting challenge rather than a test of survival. Margaret, satisfied that the transition was proceeding smoothly, excused herself to attend to various administrative matters, leaving Alexander alone with Catherine for the first time since their interview. The silence that followed was charged with possibilities, a blank canvas upon which the patterns of their future professional relationship would be drawn. "Your first priority," Alexander began, settling back into his chair and assuming the crisp, authoritative tone that had become his default mode of communication, "will be to familiarize yourself with my schedule for the remainder of the week. There are 3 board meetings, 2 client presentations, and a dinner with the mayor that will require careful coordination." Catherine nodded, pulling a leather portfolio from her briefcase and opening it to reveal pages of notes written in a clear, elegant hand. "I've already reviewed the preliminary schedule Margaret provided. The Henderson Industries meeting on Wednesday may present some complications. Their CEO has a reputation for difficult negotiations. Would you prefer me to arrange for additional preparation time?" The question demonstrated exactly the kind of proactive thinking Alexander valued in his staff, yet something in Catherine's delivery suggested she was testing the boundaries of their professional relationship even as she fulfilled its basic requirements. "Mr. Henderson is indeed challenging to work with," Alexander acknowledged. "However, I found that the most effective approach is to present him with options that appear to offer choice, while actually constraining his decisions to outcomes that serve our interests." Catherine's pen paused above her notes, and she looked up at him, with an expression that contained equal parts curiosity and something that might have been mild disapproval. "An interesting strategy, though I wonder if such manipulation might not ultimately prove counterproductive. In my experience, even the most difficult individuals respond better to genuine respect than to clever maneuvering." The comment struck Alexander like a well-aimed blow, not because it was particularly harsh, but because it exposed assumptions he had long since ceased to examine. His approach to business relationships was indeed manipulative, predicated on the belief that other people were variables to be controlled rather than partners to be engaged. Yet to hear this fundamental philosophy challenged so directly, and by someone whose professional survival depended upon his goodwill, was both shocking and oddly refreshing. You believe that respect is more effective than strategy? I believe that the two need not be mutually exclusive. The most successful negotiations I've witnessed have been those in which all parties felt their interests were genuinely understood and valued, even when compromises were ultimately necessary. Alexander found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the conversation despite his better judgment. And if the other party proves unwilling to extend the same courtesy, if they view respect as weakness to be exploited? Catherine's smile became more pronounced, and for a moment, Alexander caught a glimpse of something almost playful in her expression. Then you've learned something valuable about their character, haven't you? And that knowledge becomes a strategic advantage of its own. The observation was delivered with such casual confidence that Alexander felt momentarily off balance, as though the familiar ground beneath his feet had shifted without warning. Catherine Earnshaw possessed not only the intellectual acuity he required in an assistant, but also a perspective on human nature that challenged his most fundamental assumptions about power and influence. Their conversation was interrupted by the chime of his phone, announcing the first scheduled call of the day. As Catherine moved to answer it, Alexander watched her with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for quarterly reports or merger documents. Her voice on the phone was warm yet professional, displaying exactly the right balance of authority and accessibility. She handled the caller's questions with easy competence, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of when to defer to his judgment and when to provide information directly. Over the course of the morning, this pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Catherine managed his correspondence with efficiency that bordered on artistry, screening calls with diplomatic precision and handling the various minor crises that comprise the daily operation of a major corporation. Yet, what struck Alexander most forcefully was not her technical competence that had been evident from the beginning, but rather the way she seemed to bring a different quality of energy to the office environment. Where Margaret had maintained the kind of professional invisibility that made her supremely effective, but ultimately forgettable, Catherine's presence was impossible to ignore. She moved through the office with a natural confidence that suggested she belonged there, engaging with visiting executives and staff members as equals rather than subordinates. Her laughter, when it occurred, was genuine and infectious, creating moments of unexpected warmth in an environment that had been designed to intimidate and impress rather than welcome. By midday, Alexander found himself paying less attention to his work and more to the subtle ways in which Catherine's arrival had altered the dynamics of his professional domain. The change was not dramatic. She maintained all the proper protocols and observed every requirement of corporate hierarchy. Yet somehow, the very air seemed different, charged with possibilities that had not existed the previous week. It was during lunch, as he sat alone in his office reviewing contracts while Catherine handled his correspondence, that the first real test of their professional relationship arose. The call came from Jonathan Whitmore, the CEO of a competing firm with whom Alexander had been engaged in a particularly acrimonious dispute over a lucrative government contract. Whitmore's reputation for vicious business practices was matched only by his talent for personal insults disguised as professional discourse. Catherine appeared in his doorway, her expression carefully neutral as she announced the call. "Mr. Whitmore is on line 1. He says it's regarding the Defense Department contract." Alexander felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded particularly unpleasant conversations, the automatic defensive response that years of corporate warfare had ingrained in his very bones. "Transfer the call." As he lifted the phone to his ear, Alexander noticed that Catherine had not immediately returned to her desk, but stood instead in the doorway, her attention focused on something that seemed to lie beyond the immediate demands of office management. "Whitmore, Alexander, you magnificent bastard." Whitmore's voice carried its usual combination of false bonhomie and underlying menace. "I trust you've received our latest proposal regarding the Defense Department situation." "I have. And I trust you understand why it's entirely unacceptable." What followed was 15 minutes of the kind of verbal warfare that had characterized their professional relationship for the better part of a decade. Whitmore deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal. Veiled threats, carefully crafted insults, and the kind of psychological pressure tactics that had reduced lesser men to stammering incoherence. Alexander responded with equal venom, his voice growing progressively colder as the conversation escalated toward its inevitable conclusion of mutual recrimination and professional hostility. It was only as he finally terminated the call with more force than strictly necessary that Alexander became aware of Catherine's continued presence in his doorway. She was watching him with an expression he could not immediately interpret, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and something that might have been disappointment. "Difficult conversation?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Alexander set the phone down with deliberate precision, struggling to contain the surge of anger that such conversations invariably provoked. "Jonathan Whitmore is a snake who would sell his own mother if the price were right. Dealing with him requires a certain directness of approach." Catherine nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she was processing information beyond the mere facts of the situation. "He certainly seemed to bring out a particular side of your personality." The observation was delivered without judgment, yet Alexander felt an uncomfortable prickle of self-awareness. Something in Catherine's tone suggested she had witnessed not merely a business conversation, but a performance of sorts, a ritualized display of corporate masculinity that served purposes beyond the immediate tactical requirements of the negotiation. "The business world is not a place for the faint of heart, Catherine. Sometimes aggression is the only language certain individuals understand, perhaps. Though I wonder if there might not be more effective ways to achieve the same results." Alexander fixed her with the kind of stare that had silenced countless boardroom discussions, yet Catherine met his gaze without flinching. The silence stretched between them, charged with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. "You believe you could have handled that conversation more effectively. I believe that anger, however justified, rarely leads to optimal outcomes. Mr. Whitmore was clearly attempting to provoke you, and to some extent he succeeded. That suggests he achieved at least part of his objective, regardless of whatever concessions you may have extracted from him." The analysis was so astute, and delivered with such calm certainty, that Alexander found himself momentarily speechless. In all his years of corporate combat, no one had ever dared to critique his handling of difficult negotiations so directly. Board members deferred to his judgment, subordinates praised his tactical brilliance, and rivals either feared or envied his reputation for ruthless effectiveness. Yet here was Catherine Earnshaw, barely 4 hours into her tenure as his assistant, suggesting that his legendary ability to dominate hostile negotiations might actually be a form of weakness rather than strength. "And what would you suggest as an alternative approach?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting to the window behind his desk, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city below. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality of thoughtfulness that suggested she was sharing insights born from genuine reflection rather than mere theoretical knowledge. "I would suggest that true power lies not in the ability to intimidate or overwhelm, but in the capacity to understand what motivates others and to address those motivations in ways that serve your interests while respecting their dignity." Mr. Whitmore clearly has something he needs from you, something beyond mere professional competition. If you could identify what that is and find a way to address it constructively, you might find him far more amenable to reasonable negotiation." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, feeling as though she had just proposed rewriting the fundamental laws of physics. His entire approach to business was predicated on the assumption that power derived from the ability to impose one's will upon others, that success required the systematic elimination of weakness and vulnerability from all professional interactions. Yet Catherine was suggesting something altogether different, a form of power that derived not from domination, but from understanding, not from fear, but from a kind of strategic empathy that acknowledged the humanity of one's opponents even as it sought to outmaneuver them. The idea was both terrifying and oddly compelling, representing a complete inversion of everything he had been taught about leadership and success. To accept Catherine's perspective would require him to acknowledge that his entire professional identity might be built upon foundations that were not merely questionable, but actively counterproductive. Yet even as he rejected the possibility intellectually, Alexander found himself curious about the kind of person who could propose such radical alternatives with such calm confidence. Catherine Earnshaw was clearly more than the competent assistant he had believed himself to be hiring. She was a woman of substantial intellect and independent judgment, someone whose perspective had been shaped by experiences and insights that differed fundamentally from his own. For the remainder of the afternoon, Alexander found his attention divided between the various demands of his schedule and his growing fascination with the woman who now managed the daily operations of his professional life. Catherine handled each task with the same combination of efficiency and subtle innovation he had observed earlier, yet he began to notice additional layers of complexity in her approach to the work. When dealing with difficult vendors, she displayed a talent for finding common ground that transformed potentially contentious negotiations into collaborative problem-solving sessions. Her interactions with other staff members were marked by a genuine interest in their perspectives and concerns, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect that contrasted sharply with the atmosphere of controlled intimidation that had previously characterized the executive floor. Most intriguingly, she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when to defer to his authority and when to exercise her own judgment, navigating the complex dynamics of their professional relationship with a sophistication that suggested considerable experience in managing powerful personalities. As the day drew to a close and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office floor, Alexander found himself facing a realization that was both unwelcome and impossible to ignore. Catherine Earnshaw was going to change things. Her presence had already begun to alter the carefully controlled environment he had spent years perfecting, introducing variables that he could neither predict nor control. The question that remained was whether such changes would ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic to the delicate balance of power and influence that governed his world. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Thornfield found himself genuinely uncertain about the future, and despite his best efforts to suppress it, he discovered that uncertainty could be strangely exhilarating. At 6 o'clock, as Catherine prepared to leave for the evening, she appeared in his doorway with the same confident composure she had displayed throughout the day. "Is there anything else you'll need before I go?" Alexander looked up from the reports he had been reviewing, noting how the fading daylight seemed to soften the sharp lines of her professional attire without diminishing the intelligence that animated her features. "No, I think that will be all for today. You've exceeded my expectations." Catherine's smile in response was both pleased and slightly mysterious, as though she understood implications in his words that he had not intended to convey. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield. I look forward to tomorrow." As her footsteps faded down the corridor and the elevator carried her away from the 47th floor, Alexander sat alone in his office, surrounded by the familiar trappings of power and success, yet somehow feeling as though he stood at the threshold of something entirely unknown. Catherine Earnshaw had completed her first day with remarkable success, demonstrating exactly the kind of competence and insight he required in an assistant. Yet he could not shake the feeling that in hiring her, he had introduced into his carefully ordered existence a force that would prove far more transformative than he had anticipated. The challenge she represented was not merely professional, but personal, touching upon assumptions and beliefs that he had never before been required to examine or defend. As the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness beyond his windows, Alexander Thornfield found himself contemplating the curious paradox of having found exactly what he was looking for in the last place he had expected to encounter it, and wondering whether what he had found might ultimately prove to be more than he was prepared to handle. The second week of Catherine's employment brought with it a subtle but unmistakable shift in the rhythms that had governed Alexander's professional existence for the better part of a decade. Where once his days had unfolded with the predictable precision of clockwork, he now found himself subject to small deviations from routine that seemed to accumulate like drops of water, each insignificant in itself, yet collectively capable of wearing away the most solid foundations. It began with seemingly trivial matters. The way Catherine arranged his morning briefings to include perspectives from junior staff members whose insights had previously been filtered through multiple layers of management, or her habit of scheduling brief intervals between meetings that allowed for genuine reflection, rather than the relentless succession of obligations that had characterized his former schedule. These changes were implemented with such diplomatic subtlety that Alexander found himself accepting them before he had fully recognized their significance. Yet it was not merely the mechanical aspects of his routine that began to shift under Catherine's influence. More profound and far more unsettling were the changes in his own responses to the various challenges and opportunities that comprised the daily operation of Thornfield Industries. Where once he had approached every situation as a problem to be solved through the systematic application of authority and intimidation, he now found himself pausing to consider alternatives that would have seemed absurd just weeks earlier. The transformation became apparent during a particularly contentious board meeting on a grey Thursday morning in November. The agenda concerned the proposed acquisition of a smaller competitor whose financial difficulties had created what Alexander's advisors unanimously agreed was an exceptional opportunity for expansion. The target company employed nearly 300 people across 2 states, and its absorption into Thornfield Industries would eliminate redundancies that translated to significant cost savings and inevitable job losses for approximately half the existing workforce. Alexander had entered the meeting prepared to push through the acquisition with his customary decisiveness, backed by financial projections that made the strategic benefits undeniably clear. The board members, as expected, had raised their usual concerns about regulatory approval and integration costs, concerns that Alexander was well equipped to address through a combination of detailed analysis and the kind of forceful advocacy that had carried him through countless similar situations. Yet as the discussion progressed and the various members voiced their predictable objections and endorsements, Alexander found his attention drifting to considerations that would normally have been dismissed as irrelevant to the central question of corporate strategy. The 300 employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance were more than mere statistics in a cost-benefit analysis. They were individuals with families, mortgages, and dreams that would be shattered by decisions made in this sterile conference room high above the city's streets. The realization struck him with unexpected force, not because he had never before contemplated the human costs of corporate decisions. Such considerations were an inevitable aspect of business leadership, but because for the first time in his memory, those costs seemed to carry weight that was more than merely abstract. He found himself imagining the faces of people he had never met, envisioning the conversations that would take place around kitchen tables when the layoffs were announced, picturing the quiet desperation of experienced professionals suddenly thrust into an uncertain job market. Alexander, the voice belonged to Thomas Morrison, the board's senior member and a man whose own business philosophy aligned closely with Alexander's traditional approach to such matters. "You've been unusually quiet. I trust you're not having second thoughts about moving forward?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Alexander realized that the entire room was watching him with the kind of focused attention that suggested his momentary distraction had been more apparent than he had intended. These were men and women who had worked with him for years, who understood his decision-making process with the intimacy that comes from countless shared experiences of corporate warfare. His hesitation was not merely unexpected, it was unprecedented. "I'm considering whether there might be alternative approaches that would achieve our strategic objectives while minimizing collateral impact." The phrase sounded strange in his own mouth, a diplomatic euphemism for the kind of human consideration that had never before factored significantly into his business calculations. Several board members exchanged glances that suggested his words had been noted and would likely be discussed in private conversations after the meeting concluded. Morrison's expression reflected polite confusion. "Alternative approaches? Alexander, we've examined this opportunity from every conceivable angle. The financial benefits are clear, the strategic advantages are substantial, and our competitors would execute a similar acquisition without a moment's hesitation. What alternatives are you contemplating?" It was a reasonable question, one that deserved a coherent response based on sound business principles rather than the vague humanitarian impulses that seemed to have seized control of his usually analytical mind. Yet as Alexander searched for words that would adequately explain his sudden reluctance to proceed with a strategy that would have seemed obvious just weeks earlier, he found himself thinking of Catherine's observations about power and respect, about the possibility that true strength might derive from understanding rather than domination. "I'm wondering if we might explore options for partial integration, maintaining separate operations in key areas while achieving economies of scale through shared services and coordinated strategic planning. Such an approach would preserve employment levels while still generating significant synergies." The silence that followed his suggestion was charged with implications that extended well beyond the immediate question of corporate strategy. Alexander Thornfield, the man who had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and unwavering focus on shareholder value, was proposing a course of action that prioritized employee welfare over maximum profitability. The transformation was so radical that several board members seemed genuinely speechless. It was Margaret Chen, the newest member of the board and the only woman in the room besides the corporate secretary, who finally broke the silence. "It's an intriguing possibility, one that might also provide certain public relations advantages given the current political climate. Companies that demonstrate genuine concern for employee welfare tend to enjoy more favorable treatment from regulatory agencies and consumer advocacy groups." Her words provided a bridge between Alexander's humanitarian impulses and the hard-headed business considerations that the board understood and respected. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted from reflexive approval of the traditional acquisition model to serious discussion of innovative approaches that might serve multiple constituencies simultaneously. By the meeting's conclusion, Alexander had secured board approval for a comprehensive analysis of alternative integration strategies, buying time to explore options that would have been dismissed out of hand during any similar discussion in his pre-Catherine era. As the board members filed out of the conference room, several paused to compliment him on his strategic vision and sensitivity to stakeholder concerns, praise that felt both gratifying and oddly hollow. It was only as he returned to his office and found Catherine waiting with the afternoon's correspondence that Alexander fully grasped the extent to which her influence had begun to reshape his approach to leadership. She looked up from the documents she had been reviewing, her dark eyes reflecting the kind of intelligent interest that had become so familiar over the past 2 weeks. How did the board meeting proceed? Alexander settled into his chair, struck by the realization that Catherine's question carried genuine concern for the outcome, rather than mere professional curiosity about scheduling implications. Better than I had anticipated. We're going to explore some unconventional approaches to the Henderson acquisition. Catherine's smile suggested she understood the significance of his words beyond their immediate business context. Unconventional how? For the next 20 minutes, Alexander found himself describing not merely the strategic considerations that had influenced the board's decision, but also his own internal struggle between traditional business imperatives and newer concerns about corporate responsibility. Catherine listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel as though his words carried weight beyond their immediate practical implications, asking questions that demonstrated both business acumen and genuine interest in the ethical dimensions of corporate leadership. It was during this conversation that Alexander began to recognize the full extent of the change that had overtaken him. The man who had entered that board meeting was recognizably continuous with the person he had been throughout his professional career. Decisive, analytically rigorous, focused on results. Yet something fundamental had shifted in his internal calculus, a reordering of priorities that elevated considerations he had previously dismissed as luxuries he could not afford. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying, representing the kind of personal evolution that typically required years of deliberate effort rather than the mere passage of 2 weeks in proximity to an unusually perceptive assistant. Yet Alexander could not deny the evidence of his own experience. Catherine Earnshaw had somehow managed to awaken aspects of his personality that he had thought permanently buried beneath the accumulated weight of ambition and pragmatic necessity. Over the following days, this pattern of subtle influence continued to manifest itself in ways that were impossible to ignore. When dealing with vendors who had failed to meet delivery schedules, Alexander found himself asking about the underlying causes of their difficulties rather than simply terminating contracts and finding replacements. During negotiations with potential partners, he began incorporating questions about their corporate culture and employee satisfaction alongside the traditional focus on financial performance and strategic compatibility. Most significantly, he began to notice changes in how others responded to him. Staff members who had previously approached him with barely concealed anxiety now seemed more willing to offer substantive input during meetings. Vendors and partners commented on his newfound reasonableness, and even Jonathan Whitmore, during their most recent conversation, had seemed surprised by Alexander's willingness to explore mutually beneficial solutions rather than engaging in their customary verbal warfare. The cumulative effect of these changes was profound, yet Alexander might have continued to attribute them to natural professional evolution, were it not for an incident that occurred during Catherine's 3rd week of employment. The day had begun with unusual promise. A series of successful meetings had resulted in the preliminary approval of a major infrastructure project that would generate substantial revenue while providing genuine public benefit. Alexander was reviewing the final contracts when Catherine appeared in his doorway, her usually composed expression marked by obvious distress. "I apologize for interrupting, but there's been an incident." Alexander looked up from his documents, immediately alert to the tension in her voice. In 3 weeks of working together, he had never seen Catherine display anything approaching genuine agitation. "What kind of incident?" "It concerns Maria Santos, one of the cleaning staff. She's been accused of theft." Apparently, someone noticed that a silver paperweight had gone missing from the Henderson conference room after yesterday's meeting, and security cameras showed Maria in the area during her evening round. Alexander felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded unpleasant personnel matters. Theft by employees, regardless of the value of the items involved, required swift and decisive action to prevent the erosion of standards that could ultimately compromise the entire organization's integrity. Has she been questioned? Security is speaking with her now. She denies any involvement, claims she was simply performing her normal cleaning duties, but Catherine's voice trailed off, and Alexander noticed she was holding a manila folder with obvious reluctance. But what? Maria has a son who requires expensive medical treatment for a chronic condition. Her insurance covers most of the costs, but there have been significant out-of-pocket expenses recently. The circumstances create a compelling motive. Alexander absorbed this information with the kind of analytical detachment that had served him well in countless similar situations. Employee theft was regrettable, but not uncommon, and personal financial difficulties, however sympathetic, could not excuse criminal behavior. The appropriate course of action was clear. Terminate Maria's employment immediately, press charges if warranted, and use the incident as an example to deter similar problems in the future. Yet as he prepared to issue the necessary instructions, Alexander found himself thinking about the woman behind the statistics, a mother struggling to care for a sick child, working late-night shifts to clean the offices of people who earned more in a day than she might see in a year. The image was uncomfortably vivid, made more so by his recent tendency to consider the human dimensions of corporate decisions. I want to speak with her. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly, though her expression suggested surprise rather than disapproval. The security chief recommended against direct involvement. He's concerned about potential legal complications if charges are ultimately filed. Nevertheless, I want to hear her side of the story. 20 minutes later, Alexander found himself in the uncomfortable position of sitting across from Maria Santos in a sterile conference room normally reserved for high-level strategic planning sessions. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, her slight frame dwarfed by the imposing furniture and expensive artwork that surrounded them. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, though whether from fear or some other emotion, Alexander could not determine. Mr. Goldfield, I swear to you on my son's life, I never took anything from anyone. I've worked for this company for 8 years, never even been late to work, never caused any trouble. I wouldn't risk my job for anything, especially not now when Miguel needs me so much. The words were delivered with a dignity that transcended her obvious terror, and Alexander found himself studying her face with the same intensity he might have applied to reviewing a crucial contract. What he saw there was not the shifty desperation he might have expected from a guilty employee, but rather the profound exhaustion of someone carrying burdens that would have crushed a lesser person. Tell me about your son. For the next 10 minutes, Maria described Miguel's battle with juvenile diabetes, the complications that had required multiple hospitalizations, and the financial strain that had gradually consumed every aspect of her family's life. Her words painted a picture of quiet heroism, a mother working multiple jobs to afford medications and treatments, sacrificing every personal comfort to ensure her child's survival. As she spoke, Alexander became aware of an uncomfortable truth. Maria Santos possessed a strength of character that put his own privileged struggles into harsh perspective. While he had spent years accumulating power and wealth for their own sake, she had dedicated herself to the most fundamental of human purposes, protecting and nurturing the life she had brought into the world. Maria, he said finally, his voice gentler than he had intended, I want you to know that we're going to investigate this matter thoroughly. If you're innocent, and I have reason to believe you are, then we'll find the real explanation for what happened. Bam! The relief that flooded her features was so profound that Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Here was a woman whose entire future had hung in the balance, whose son's medical care depended on her continued employment. who had faced the prospect of professional and financial ruin with a dignity that humbled him. Over the following hours, a more thorough investigation revealed that the missing paperweight had simply been moved to another conference room by facilities staff as part of routine maintenance. The security footage that had seemed so damning was explained by Maria's normal cleaning routine, which had taken her through the Henderson room at the designated time. Yet, it was not the resolution of the immediate crisis that stayed with Alexander as he returned to his office that evening. Rather, it was the realization that his first instinct had been to assume guilt based on circumstantial evidence and financial motive, while Catherine's obvious distress had reflected a deeper understanding of the human costs involved in such situations. Had he proceeded according to his traditional approach, Maria Santos would have been terminated and possibly charged with theft, her son's medical treatment endangered, and her 8 years of loyal service dismissed in favor of expedient corporate justice. The thought of such a miscarriage filling him with an emotion he could not immediately identify, but which felt suspiciously like shame. As he sat alone in his office, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness, Alexander found himself confronting a truth that was both simple and revolutionary. Catherine Earnshaw was not merely changing how he conducted business. She was changing who he was as a human being. Her influence was transforming him from a man who saw other people primarily as obstacles or resources into someone who recognized their fundamental humanity and dignity. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, representing the kind of personal transformation that could not be easily reversed or controlled. For 34 years, Alexander had defined himself primarily through his professional achievements and financial success, measuring his worth by his ability to dominate markets and intimidate competitors. Yet Catherine had somehow managed to awaken in him a capacity for empathy and moral consideration that he had thought permanently buried beneath the accumulated weight of ambition and pragmatic necessity. She had made him want to be not merely successful, but worthy of success, a distinction that would have seemed meaningless just weeks earlier, but now felt like the most important challenge he had ever faced. As he prepared to leave the office that night, Alexander paused at Catherine's desk, where she was gathering her belongings after another day of exemplary service. She looked up at his approach, her dark eyes reflecting the kind of intelligent concern that had become so familiar and yet so indispensable to his daily existence. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their brevity might suggest. Catherine's smile in response was both knowing and warm, suggesting she understood exactly what he was thanking her for and why such gratitude might be difficult for him to express. "You're very welcome, Alexander. I'll see you tomorrow." As the elevator carried him down from the 47th floor toward the street level, Alexander Thornfield found himself contemplating the curious paradox of his situation. In hiring Catherine Earnshaw, he had sought nothing more than a competent assistant capable of managing the routine demands of his professional life. Instead, he had found someone whose influence was gradually transforming not merely how he conducted business, but how he understood his place in the world. The change was profound and irreversible, representing the kind of personal evolution that typically required years of deliberate effort rather than the mere passage of 3 weeks in proximity to an unusually perceptive woman. Yet, Alexander could not deny the evidence of his own experience, could not ignore the gradual awakening of aspects of his personality that he had thought permanently buried beneath the accumulated weight of ambition and pragmatic necessity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test the principles and perspectives that Catherine had helped him discover. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander found himself genuinely uncertain about what the future might hold, and despite the discomfort such uncertainty inevitably created, he discovered that he was looking forward to finding out. The transformation that had begun so subtly in the sterile corridors of Thornfield Industries reached its inevitable crescendo On a snow-laden evening in late December, when the city lay blanketed in pristine white that seemed to muffle not only sound, but the very urgency that typically drove Alexander's existence. The year-end had brought with it the usual flurry of reports, evaluations, and strategic planning sessions. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms of corporate obligation, Alexander had become increasingly aware of undercurrents that threatened to overwhelm the careful boundaries he had maintained between his professional and personal lives. Catherine had been with him for nearly 2 months, and in that brief span of time, she had accomplished something that no board of directors, no competitor, no personal crisis had ever managed to achieve. She had made him question not merely his methods, but his fundamental assumptions about what constituted a life worth living. The changes in his professional conduct had been observable and measurable. Colleagues remarked upon his newfound diplomatic approach to negotiations. Employees spoke cautiously of improved morale on the executive floor, and even his most bitter rivals had begun to approach their interactions with something approaching respect rather than the mutual hostility that had previously characterized such encounters. Yet it was the private transformations that proved most profound and unsettling. Alexander found himself awakening each morning with something he had not experienced since his youth: genuine anticipation for the day ahead. The prospect of seeing Catherine, of engaging in their increasingly complex conversations about business philosophy and human nature, had become a source of energy that sustained him through even the most challenging professional obligations. This evolution had not occurred without internal struggle. The man who had spent 15 years constructing an identity based upon emotional detachment and strategic manipulation did not surrender such defenses easily. There were moments, entire days sometimes, when Alexander attempted to reassert the old patterns, to treat Catherine with the same professional distance he maintained with all other employees, to reduce their interactions to the purely transactional requirements of their respective roles. Such efforts invariably failed, undermined by Catherine's remarkable ability to perceive the genuine person beneath his carefully constructed professional persona. She responded to his moments of deliberate coldness with neither hurt nor anger, but with a kind of patient understanding that suggested she recognized them as defensive maneuvers rather than authentic expressions of his character. Her consistency in this regard was both maddening and profoundly reassuring, creating a stability in their relationship that allowed Alexander to experiment with vulnerability without fear of exploitation or judgment. The crisis that would ultimately force a resolution to these gradually accumulating tensions arrived, appropriately enough, through the very mechanisms of corporate power that had defined Alexander's existence for so many years. Jonathan Whitmore, his longest-standing rival, had apparently decided that Alexander's recent behavioral changes represented weakness rather than evolution, and had begun orchestrating a series of strategic moves designed to exploit what he perceived as newly revealed vulnerabilities. The attack, when it came, was sophisticated and multifaceted, targeting not merely Thornfield Industries' market position, but Alexander's personal reputation within the broader business community. Whitmore had somehow obtained information about several of Alexander's recent decisions: the Henderson acquisition's unconventional structure, his intervention in the Maria Santos matter, his newfound emphasis on stakeholder welfare over pure profit maximization, and was using these examples to construct a narrative of declining competitiveness and misguided sentimentality. The campaign reached its peak with an article in the Wall Street Journal that portrayed Alexander as a formerly formidable executive whose edge had been dulled by success and age, whose recent decisions suggested a troubling departure from the ruthless focus that had made him legendary. The piece was masterfully crafted, weaving together legitimate business analysis with subtle character assassination, creating an impression of decline that would be difficult to refute through mere contradictory statements. Alexander learned of the article's publication on a Thursday morning in mid-December, when Catherine appeared in his office with an expression of controlled concern that immediately alerted him to the gravity of the situation. She set the newspaper on his desk without comment, allowing him to absorb the full impact of Whitmore's assault in relative privacy. As he read, Alexander felt the familiar surge of anger that had always accompanied professional attacks, the automatic defensive response that demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Yet beneath this predictable reaction, he detected something new, a curious sense of liberation that came from recognizing that Whitmore's characterization, while intended as criticism, actually described a transformation that Alexander had come to value rather than regret. "How bad is it?" he asked finally, looking up to find Catherine watching him with the kind of steady attention that had become so characteristic of their interactions. "The immediate market response has been minimal. Your reputation for competence is too well established to be significantly damaged by a single article. However, there are indications that several competitors are planning to use this as an opportunity to challenge your position on various ongoing negotiations." Alexander nodded, appreciating Catherine's straightforward assessment while noting the absence of the sympathy or indignation that other associates might have displayed. She understood, as few others could, that this attack represented not merely a business challenge, but a test of the fundamental changes that had been occurring within him over the past months. "What would you recommend?" The question surprised them both. In his entire professional career, Alexander had never asked a subordinate, even one as capable as Catherine, for strategic advice regarding matters of such personal and professional significance. Yet the words had emerged naturally, reflecting a level of trust and respect that transcended conventional hierarchical boundaries. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her gaze shifting to the window behind his desk, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered city. When she spoke, her voice carried the thoughtful quality that Alexander had come to associate with her most profound insights. "I think the question isn't how to respond to Mr. Whitmore's attack, but rather how to respond in a way that reflects who you've become rather than who you used to be." The old Alexander Thornfield would have launched an immediate counterattack, would have used every weapon in his considerable arsenal to destroy Whitmore's credibility and professional standing. But I suspect that approach would ultimately be self-defeating, because it would require you to become someone you no longer wish to be. The observation struck Alexander with the force of revelation, crystallizing thoughts and feelings that had been accumulating beneath the surface of consciousness for weeks. Whitmore's attack was indeed a test, but not in the way either of them had initially conceived it. Rather than testing Alexander's capacity for ruthless retaliation, it was testing his commitment to the new principles and perspectives that Catherine had helped him discover. And what would the new Alexander Thornfield do? Catherine's smile suggested she had been hoping he would ask exactly that question. He would demonstrate through actions, rather than words, that the changes in his approach represent strength rather than weakness. He would show that it's possible to be both successful and humane, both competitive and ethical. He would prove that the old ways of doing business aren't the only ways, or necessarily the best ways. Over the following days, this philosophy was put to the ultimate test as competitors and partners alike watched to see how Alexander would respond to the mounting pressure. Whitmore escalated his campaign, using proxies and allies to question Alexander's fitness for leadership, his commitment to shareholder value, and his understanding of competitive realities in an increasingly challenging market environment. Yet instead of responding with the expected fury and retaliation, Alexander chose a different path. He focused his energies on completing the Henderson acquisition according to the unconventional model the board had approved, demonstrating that it was possible to achieve significant business objectives while preserving employment and respecting stakeholder interests. He accelerated several charitable initiatives that Thornfield Industries had been considering, showing that corporate social responsibility could enhance rather than compromise profitability. Most significantly, he began speaking publicly about his evolving philosophy of leadership, articulating in interviews and conference presentations a vision of business success that incorporated moral considerations alongside financial metrics. These appearances required him to defend positions that would have seemed absurd just months earlier, yet he found himself arguing with genuine conviction for approaches that balanced profit maximization with broader social obligations. The response was mixed, but gradually positive. Younger executives and emerging leaders expressed enthusiasm for Alexander's message, while more traditional voices within the business community remained skeptical. Yet even critics were forced to acknowledge that his recent performance had been exemplary by any conventional measure. Profits were up, market share was expanding, and employee satisfaction had reached unprecedented levels. It was during this period of professional vindication that Alexander finally confronted the personal implications of his transformation. The changes in his business philosophy had been accompanied by equally profound shifts in his understanding of what he wanted from life, of what kinds of relationships and experiences might provide the fulfillment that wealth and power had proven incapable of delivering. The realization crystallized during a late evening in mid-December, when he and Catherine were working together to finalize the details of a major charitable contribution that would provide scholarships for children from low-income families. The work itself was routine, reviewing legal documents, coordinating with foundation representatives, ensuring that the donation structure would maximize both impact and tax benefits. Yet as they worked side by side in the quiet intimacy of his office, with the city lights twinkling beyond the windows and the soft hum of the building's ventilation system providing a gentle backdrop to their conversation, Alexander became acutely aware of how natural and comfortable their collaboration had become. Catherine's presence no longer felt like that of an employee, but rather like that of a partner, someone whose perspectives and insights had become integral to his decision-making process. More than that, he realized with a mixture of exhilaration and terror, she had become essential to his sense of himself as a worthwhile human being. The person he was when he was with her, thoughtful, ethical, capable of genuine warmth and consideration, represented not merely an improvement over his former self, but the man he had always had the potential to become. "Catherine," he said suddenly, interrupting their discussion of foundation governance structures, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the documents she had been reviewing, her dark eyes reflecting the kind of intelligent attention that had become so familiar and yet so precious to him. "You've changed my life." The words hung in the air between them, simple, yet weighted with implications that neither could ignore. Alexander felt his heart racing as he watched her expression, searching for some indication of how his confession might be received. Catherine set down her pen with deliberate care, her movements precise, yet somehow conveying deep emotion. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality of warmth that made Alexander's chest tighten with hope and fear. "And you've changed mine, Alexander, more than you know." Nay, the admission created a silence that was charged with possibilities. A moment of recognition that acknowledged the profound connection that had developed between them despite, or perhaps because of, the ostensibly professional nature of their relationship. Alexander felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that whatever he said or did next would determine not merely the future of their working relationship, but the trajectory of his entire life. "I'm in love with you." The declaration emerged with startling clarity, cutting through months of careful professional boundaries and calculated emotional restraint. Alexander had not planned to speak those words, had not even fully acknowledged their truth to himself until the moment they left his lips. Yet having spoken them, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended his fear of rejection or professional complications. Catherine's response was not immediate, and in the silence that followed his confession, Alexander experienced what felt like a lifetime of uncertainty. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying a quality of emotion that made his breath catch in his throat. "I love you too." The words seemed to transform the very air in the room, creating a space that existed outside the normal boundaries of corporate hierarchies and professional obligations. Alexander felt as though he had spent his entire adult life holding his breath and could finally exhale, as though the careful defenses he had constructed around his heart had suddenly become not merely unnecessary, but actively impediments to the life he wanted to live. They talked through the night, exploring the implications of their mutual confession with the same thoughtful intelligence they had brought to every other aspect of their relationship. They discussed the practical challenges that would need to be addressed, the potential complications of romantic involvement between employer and employee, the gossip and speculation that would inevitably follow any public acknowledgement of their relationship, the delicate balance that would be required to maintain professional effectiveness while honoring personal feelings. Yet beneath these practical considerations lay a deeper recognition that what had developed between them transcended conventional categories of professional or personal relationship. Catherine had not merely become his assistant or even his romantic partner. She had become his moral compass, his conscience, his guide toward a version of himself that was worthy of love and respect. As dawn broke over the city and the first light of a new day filtered through the windows of his office, Alexander found himself contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months earlier, he had been a man defined entirely by his professional accomplishments and financial success, someone who measured his worth through his ability to intimidate and control others. Now, as he looked at Catherine's face in the early morning light, seeing there the intelligence and warmth that had gradually transformed every aspect of his existence, Alexander understood that true power lay not in the capacity to dominate, but in the willingness to be vulnerable, not in the accumulation of wealth, but in the cultivation of relationships that enriched the human spirit. The future remained uncertain. There would be challenges to navigate, adjustments to make, perhaps even sacrifices to endure. Yet for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Thornfield felt genuinely hopeful about what lay ahead, confident that whatever obstacles might arise, he would face them not as the isolated, driven man he had once been, but as someone capable of love and worthy of being loved in return. Catherine had dared to do what no one ever imagined. She had seen past the fearsome reputation and accumulated power to the person he might become, had loved him not for what he possessed, but for who he was beneath all the layers of professional armor and emotional defense. In doing so, she had given him the greatest gift imaginable, the opportunity to become someone he could respect, someone who could build a life based on connection rather than control, on love rather than fear. As they prepared to leave the office together, stepping out into a world that would soon learn of the transformation that had taken place within the walls of Thornfield Industries, Alexander took Catherine's hand in his and felt the future unfold before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled.